At 0810 on the morning of June 19th, 1944, Vice Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo stood on the flag bridge of the carrier Taiho, the newest and most powerfully armored fleet carrier in the Imperial Japanese Navy, 350 miles northwest of Guam, when a torpedo struck his ship. The explosion came from the American submarine USS Albacore, which had closed to within 1,500 yards of the carrier before firing. A single Mark 14 torpedo hit the Taiho's starboard bow just forward of the forward elevator shaft. The ship shuddered. Reports came up from engineering within minutes. The Taiho was 29,930 tons, built with internal compartmentalization and hull protection that Japan's older carriers had lacked. The initial damage assessment was cautious, but not alarming. The ship could continue flight operations. 20 minutes earlier, Ozawa had launched his first strike wave toward Task Force 58. 69 aircraft were now flying southeast in careful formation. He decided to continue the operation. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. He did not know that the torpedo had fractured an aviation fuel line deep in the Taiho's lower interior. He did not know that vapors were accumulating below decks, while damage control teams attempted to ventilate the space using methods that surviving engineering officers would later testify had worsened rather than reduced the concentration. He did not know that at 15:32 that afternoon the accumulated vapors would reach ignition points simultaneously in multiple compartments, that the explosion would split the carrier's keel, and that the Taiho would be on the bottom of the Philippine Sea before the sun went down. And he did not know that the 69 aircraft he had just launched were heading toward an interception that would destroy 50 of them before a single one reached its target. What he knew in those first minutes after the torpedo hit was what 6 months of careful planning in the spring of 1944 had given him. He knew that his aircraft could reach Task Force 58 from this range, and that the American carriers could not reach him. He knew that land-based aviation from the Marianas was supposed to be adding its weight to his strike packages, multiplying his effective numbers against the defenses. And he knew, in the way experienced commanders know such things in the final hours before the test, that the margin for error was thin. The margin for error was already gone. It had disappeared 5 days earlier, quietly, in a series of American carrier strikes on the Marianas airfields that Ozawa's communications system had not been able to represent to him accurately enough to act on. This is the story of what the admirals of the Imperial Japanese Navy were told, what they believed, and what they said in the months when American carrier task forces began crossing into waters that Japanese strategy had declared inviolable. It is a story about the distance between doctrine and reality, between what a plan requires and what a battle actually provides. And it is a story about men of professional competence who had been handed a strategic position so compromised by the spring of 1944 that no amount of tactical skill or organizational resolve could restore what had already been lost. Some of them understood this before the battle began. Some understood it only when the arithmetic of the engagement made denial impossible. Their words, will they survive, are unusually candid. They had nowhere left to hide behind optimism. The absolute national defense sphere was Japan's formal declaration of what could not be crossed. Imperial General Headquarters issued the directive establishing it in September 1943, 6 weeks after the fall of Munda Airfield in the Solomons. The document defined an inner ring of Japanese-held positions running from the Kuriil Islands through the Marianas, Western Carolines, West New Guinea, and the Sunda Islands. Within this boundary, Allied forces were to be destroyed before they could establish a foothold. Outside it, Japan accepted the loss of territory as an acceptable cost. Inside it, there was no acceptable loss of anything. The combined fleet, working in coordination with land-based air from the surrounding island chain, would engage and destroy any American carrier force that penetrated the sphere's boundaries at distances and under conditions of Japan's choosing. The operational anchor of the entire structure was Truk Atoll in the Caroline Islands. The lagoon at Truk was 50 miles across, sheltered on all sides by a ring of enclosing islands and fringing reef, deep enough to hold the entire combined fleet and positioned at the geographic center of Japan's Pacific holdings. American strategic assessments compared it to Gibraltar. Japan had spent 3 years fortifying it. Repair basins, torpedo storage, underground command bunkers, aircraft maintenance facilities, and a garrison of land-based naval aviation intended to serve as the first line of defense against any carrier force that attempted to approach from the east. When Japanese admirals spoke about the absolute defense sphere holding, they meant, above all, that Truk would hold. The officer responsible for that defense was Admiral Koga Minaichi, who had assumed command of the combined fleet in April 1943 after Yamamoto Isoroku was shot down over Bougainville. Koga was 57 years old, patient and methodical, and possessed of a clarity about Japan's material position that the more publicly confident strains of Imperial Navy culture found uncomfortable to hear. He knew that the carrier losses at Midway had stripped the fleet of its 4 most experienced air groups, and that the training establishment had never been designed to replace them at the rate combat was consuming aviators in the Solomons. He knew that American shipyards were launching fleet carriers faster than any historical precedent. The trajectory was unmistakable to anyone who read the production figures honestly, and Koga read them. He had one path that offered a realistic prospect of an outcome acceptable to Japan. The decisive fleet engagement, the Kantai Kessen, had been the foundation of Japanese naval doctrine since the Meiji era. A single climactic battle, fought in waters where Japanese land-based aviation could add its weight to the carrier air groups, against an American fleet that had been attrited and channeled into those waters by Japan's outer defensive positions, conducted at a moment before American carrier strength reached its full mass. One engagement, one answer. His plan for it was designated the Z Operations, Combined Fleet Top Secret Order No. 73. The document laid out the conditions for the decisive battle in detailed terms. The positioning of shore-based aviation across the central Pacific island chain, the role of the surface fleet in the engagement's final phase, the coordination mechanism between carrier and land-based air that would compensate for Japan's growing numerical disadvantage in aircraft and pilots. It was distributed in physical copy only to a small list of senior officers under the strictest classification protocols Japan maintained. In February 1944, the foundations of everything the Z Plan assumed began to collapse. American fast carrier task forces had been reorganized under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher into Task Force 58, 9 carriers operating in coordinated groups with an escort of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers capable of sustained operations anywhere in the open Pacific. The Marshall Islands were falling to American amphibious forces in the same weeks. Kwajalein, which sat at the outer boundary of Japan's defensive perimeter, surrendered on February 6th. Eniwetok followed 3 weeks later. The outermost ring of the absolute defense sphere had been dismantled before the document that established it had been in effect for 6 months. On February 17th, 1944, Task Force 58 arrived at Truk. Koga had read the approach of the American forces correctly enough to evacuate his carriers and capital ships from the atoll weeks earlier, repositioning his flag to Palau. What remained at Truk when the first wave of Hellcats appeared in the pre-dawn darkness of the 17th was the air garrison, the auxiliary shipping, the fuel stores and repair facilities, and a logistical infrastructure that had made the base strategically valuable. The Hellcats struck the airfields first, arriving before the Japanese defenders had organized their scramble response. Action reports from Mitcher's carriers in the hours that followed described the engagements above the lagoon with the economy of language that comes from lopsided outcomes. 270 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in 2 days of operations. 3 light cruisers were sunk inside the lagoon, along with several destroyers and more than 30 merchant and auxiliary vessels. American combat losses over the entire operation totaled approximately 25 aircraft. Koga received the damage reports at Palau. The absolute defense sphere had been crossed at its most fortified position by an American carrier force that had operated inside it for 48 hours and then withdrawn intact, fully capable of repeating the operation the following week. The warning margin his planning had assumed, the detection time sufficient for shore-based aviation to degrade the incoming force before it reached strike range, had not existed. Task Force 58 had come at night and struck at dawn. The historian Carl Boyd, drawing on Japanese naval records and post-war interrogation transcripts, describes the period following the truck raid as one in which Koga's staff worked to accelerate Z operations planning, while American pressure on the outer positions continued at a pace the planning documents had not anticipated. The Marianas were being struck by carrier air. The construction schedule for the fighter strips that the Z plan required for land-based coordination was falling behind under American interdiction. The timetable was compressing on every axis simultaneously. On March 31st, 1944, Koga died. He was evacuating from Palau aboard a Kawanishi H-8K flying boat as American carrier forces threatened that base. His chief of staff, Vice Admiral Fukudome Shigeru, was in a second aircraft on the same route. Both planes flew into a severe tropical storm somewhere over the Philippine Islands. Koga's aircraft went into the sea. His body was never recovered. Fukudome's aircraft also came down near the Philippine coast. Fukudome survived and was captured by Filipino guerrillas working in coordination with American intelligence networks in the islands. What was recovered from the wreckage of Fukudome's aircraft and transmitted to MacArthur's command in Leyte within weeks included physical copies of Combined Fleet Top Secret Order No. 73, the Z Plan. By the time Japanese diplomatic pressure secured Fukudome's release and return to duty, the document was in the hands of American naval intelligence at Pearl Harbor. The Americans knew how Japan intended to fight the decisive battle. The full operational weight of that compromise is difficult to measure exactly because it overlapped with tactical failures that would have degraded the plan's execution even without the intelligence breach. What it eliminated, with certainty, was the element of surprise that the Z plan's architecture depended on. Japan had designed the decisive battle around knowing the engagement's conditions while the Americans did not. That asymmetry no longer existed. Admiral Toyoda Somu, who assumed command of the combined fleet in May 1944, inherited the plan, its compromised security, a naval aviation force that had been expended through 2 years of attrition in the Solomons and Central Pacific at a rate the training establishment had never recovered from, and a strategic timeline that had become genuinely urgent. American amphibious forces were moving on the Marianas. If Saipan, Tinian, and Guam fell, American B-29 superfortresses would be within reach of the Japanese home islands. The decisive battle that Japan had been conserving for the right moment had now become the only option available for this moment, right or not. Toyota issued the operational order activating AGO on June 13th. If this story is landing with you, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep producing work like this. The man Toyota sent to execute it was Vice Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo, commanding the first mobile fleet, 9 carriers with a combined air wing of approximately 470 aircraft. Ozawa was not a commander who avoided honest accounting of his position. He had examined the operational situation in the weeks before AGO with the attention of a man who understood that his force was outnumbered in aircraft, outtrained at the individual pilot level, and operating with a carrier air arm that bore almost no resemblance, in quality or depth, to the one Japan had committed at Pearl Harbor and Midway. He built his plan around the one genuine material advantage he retained. Japanese carrier aircraft, stripped of pilot armor and self-sealing fuel tanks in the design philosophy that had governed naval aviation since the 1930s, were lighter and carried more fuel than their American counterparts. This design choice, which had produced catastrophic aircrew loss rates throughout the war, also produced aircraft with a genuine range advantage. Ozawa's calculations established that his strike aircraft could hit Task Force 58 from approximately 300 miles, well beyond the effective return strike radius of Hellcats and Avengers launched from American carrier decks. He would conduct his attacks from outside American reach, using his range advantage to strike without being struck, while land-based aviation from the Marianas airfields added its weight to his carrier packages. The plan was technically coherent. It was also constructed on an assumption about the condition of those Marianas airfields that had been false for 5 days before Ozawa received his orders. Task Force 58 under Mitchell had spent June 11th through June 15th systematically striking every airfield in the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Rota, and Yap, as well as truck and installations at Yap. The strikes were thorough and sequential. Runways were cratered. Fuel storage was hit. Aircraft on the ground were destroyed or dispersed into conditions that made coordinated operations from those strips impossible on the timelines the AGO plan required. Action reports from those 5 days, now held at the National Archives, show the elimination of approximately 150 Japanese aircraft and the severe degradation of the base infrastructure across the island chain. By June 19th, the land-based component of Ozawa's plan was not what his planning documents assumed it to be. It was largely gone. Ozawa had not received this information in a form that would have allowed him to revise his operational assumptions. His communications with the Marianas-based commands were inadequate to the task of correcting his planning picture in real time. Radio silence, imposed to preserve the element of surprise during his approach, had further constrained the flow of damage assessments from shore to fleet. He launched his first wave believing that the island airfields would contribute to the strikes he was sending against Task Force 58. They would not. At 0830 on the morning of June 19th, the Taiho's flight deck dispatched 69 aircraft into a clear sky over the Philippine Sea. 20 minutes earlier, at 0810, a torpedo had fractured the carrier's fuel line. At 0:10:11 that morning, radar operators aboard the picket destroyers of Task Force 58's outer screen detected the inbound formation at a range of 150 miles. The contact report reached the Fighter Direction Center aboard Mitchell's flagship USS Lexington within minutes. Flight directors began vectoring Hellcats from 8 carrier air groups to intercept positions stacked between 15,000 and 24,000 feet. By the time Ozawa's first wave crossed the outer screen 60 miles from the nearest American carrier, 300 Hellcats were in the air between them and their targets, holding altitude advantage and receiving radar guidance with a precision that the Japanese pilots, operating in loose coordination at the edge of their fuel range, could not match or anticipate. The first contact lasted less than 10 minutes before the Japanese formation lost coherence. Some pilots broke formation to maneuver defensively. Others pressed forward. The Hellcats did not make this distinction in their tactics. They selected and engaged with the efficiency of pilots who had been trained against the exact performance profile of the aircraft they were now shooting at, who carried enough fuel to sustain extended engagements, and who flew machines that would absorb damage and bring them home. The Japanese aircraft that caught fire in the Philippine sea sky on June 19th caught fire completely, reliably, and finally. They were built that way. 50 aircraft from Ozawa's first wave did not return to their carriers. Of the 19 that did, several were damaged beyond immediate operational use. 3 more waves launched through the morning and afternoon, each one detected at long range. Each one met before it reached the carriers. The second wave sent 128 aircraft. 27 came back. The third wave of approximately 50 aircraft achieved the worst target coordination of any of them. Arriving in fragments after navigation problems disrupted the formation's approach and lost the great majority to interception and anti-aircraft fire over the fleet. The fourth wave, 82 aircraft, contributed the day's final arithmetic to a total that was becoming difficult to describe in any terms other than catastrophe. By late afternoon, Ozawa had received contact reports suggesting that his strikes had achieved significant results against Task Force 58. The reports were wrong. They were the product of combat claims by survivors operating under fire at long range, filtered through a communications system that had been under strain since the engagement began, processed by a staff that had no reliable, independent means of verification. What American damage assessment recorded that evening was minor. What Japanese aircraft losses recorded was not. At 15:32, the Taiho exploded. The aviation fuel vapors that damage control parties had spent 7 hours failing to clear reached simultaneous ignition in multiple below-deck spaces. The internal explosion broke the carrier open, the armored flight deck providing no protection against a detonation originating below it, and the ship that had been designed to survive the kind of attack that had sunk Japan's older carriers was gone within hours. Staff officers transferred Ozawa to the cruiser Haguro in the confusion following the explosion. He arrived aboard with wet clothes and a communications picture that was still telling him the battle might be recoverable. The Shokaku was already gone. USS Kavala had put 3 torpedoes into her at approximately 12:20, striking her aviation fuel system in the manner that had become characteristic of Japanese carrier losses throughout the Pacific War. The Shokaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and the Eastern Solomons, sank at approximately 1500. That evening, June 19th, Ozawa composed a signal to Combined Fleet Headquarters requesting permission to refuel and continue the operation the following day. He believed, based on the information available to him, that his forces had inflicted enough damage on Task Force 58 to justify pressing the engagement. Combined Fleet replied that he should use his discretion. Ozawa decided to continue. He did not yet know how many aircraft he had left. The night of June 19th passed for Ozawa aboard the cruiser Haguro in a state of progressive revelation. Contact reports from his surviving aircraft had continued through the evening to suggest that his strikes had achieved significant results against Task Force 58. Staff officers worked through the darkness, compiling the actual numbers of aircraft that had launched versus aircraft that had returned to their carriers, and what assembled itself from those numbers was not what any of them wanted to read. He still had roughly 100 aircraft. He elected to refuel from his tankers and attempt operations the following day. At approximately 1500 on June 20th, American search aircraft from Task Force 58 found Ozawa's fleet. The range was 275 miles, at the outer edge of a practical strike radius for the Hellcats and Avengers aboard Mitcher's carriers, and considerably beyond what standard fuel calculations would authorize under normal operating procedure. Mitcher reviewed the numbers. His pilots would be returning to the fleet in darkness, low on fuel, after an engagement conducted at maximum range. He launched everything he had. Approximately 216 aircraft flew southwest toward the Japanese fleet in the late afternoon. The strike found Ozawa's force near sunset. The carrier Taiho, a converted passenger liner that had been pressed into fleet service and had served through the Pacific War in that capacity, was hit by aerial torpedoes from aircraft off USS Bellowwood and sank before midnight. The fleet carriers Zuikaku and Junyo were damaged. The light carriers Zuho and Chiyoda were hit. Ozawa had barely begun to absorb the losses of the previous day when this additional accounting was imposed on him. What happened after the strike, aboard Mitcher's carriers, was recorded in the flag logs of Task Force 58 and has been documented by every serious history of the Pacific Carrier War. The American aircraft were returning in darkness, low on fuel, to a fleet running in radio silence on a sea without visible reference. Standard navigation lights were off. Mitcher weighed the submarine threat and set it against the certainty that his pilots would go into the water if they could not find their ships. He gave the order, "Turn on the lights." Every carrier in Task Force 58 lit up. Running lights, truck lights, searchlights pointed straight into the night sky. The order broke every anti-submarine protocol the Pacific Fleet observed. His chief of staff, Captain Arleigh Burke, recorded the decision without editorial comment in the flag log, which was the appropriate professional response to a command that violated rules in order to save men and that Mitcher accepted full responsibility for. Approximately 80 American aircraft went into the water during the night recovery, nearly all of them out of fuel rather than combat damage. Mitcher ordered his destroyers into the recovery area immediately, and in the hours that followed, most of the pilots and aircrew were pulled from the sea alive. American aircrew losses for the entire two-day battle totaled 49 men killed. The number of Japanese aircrew who did not return was not tallied with precision in the immediate aftermath, because there was no adequate communication system to gather the count, but the eventual accounting would establish that the great majority of the 473 carrier aircraft Ozawa had committed over the 2 days were gone, and that most of the men in them were gone with them. On the morning of June 21st, Ozawa compiled what he knew. He had 3 fleet carriers sunk, 2 others damaged, and approximately 35 carrier aircraft that could be confirmed as returned to their ships. His land-based air component, which was supposed to have multiplied his effective striking power throughout the engagement, had been largely destroyed before the battle began. He had not been able to verify this during the operation itself. He could verify it now. He transmitted his damage report to Combined Fleet Headquarters and submitted a request to be relieved of command. Admiral Toyota did not accept the request. He needed Ozawa for what he was already planning. The after-action report Ozawa submitted to Combined Fleet in the days following AGO is referenced in detail in Samuel Eliot Morrison's Official American Naval History and discussed in the United States Strategic Bombing Survey interrogation records compiled after Japan's surrender. The document was notable for its directness. Ozawa identified the failure of the land-based air coordination as the central operational shortcoming, distinguishing between what the plan had required of that component and what it had actually been capable of providing at the time of the engagement. He identified the radar-guided fighter direction of Task Force 58 as a capability his force had had no effective counter for, one that had negated the range advantage he had built his tactical plan around by ensuring that his aircraft were engaged well before they reached their targets. He noted, without extended analysis, that the quality of his pilots relative to the Americans opposing them had been a material factor across all 4 strike waves. The post-war interrogation of Ozawa by United States Strategic Bombing Survey officers, conducted in late 1945 and preserved in the USSBS Naval Analysis Division records, extends these observations in terms that were candid to a degree unusual in the wartime assessments of flag officers from any navy. Ozawa stated that by the spring of 1944, he had understood that his force was not adequate to accomplish the objectives AGO required, but that the strategic situation offered no alternative. The Marianas had to be defended. Defending them required committing the carriers. Committing the carriers was, in the conditions that actually prevailed on June 19th, an operation that consumed assets out of proportion to any result it could produce. He said this, in those terms, on the record. He also told his interrogators that he had known, going into the battle, that his pilots were not equal to the task the plan assigned them. This is the part of the accounting that the Z plan could not have addressed, regardless of whether it had been captured. The aircraft could be built, and were being built. The carriers existed. The engines, and the airframes, and the deck crews existed. What could not be manufactured in the quantities the war required, at the quality the war demanded, was the man in the cockpit. The Yokorin program, Japan's pre-war naval aviation training system, had been designed to produce pilots to a standard that American intelligence officers in the early months of the war assessed as among the finest in the world. The program required years and hundreds of hours of flight training before a graduate flew a first combat mission. It screened its candidates with extraordinary rigor. The men who had attacked Pearl Harbor and held the Pacific skies through the first half of the war were the product of a system designed to produce a small number of exceptional individuals. It was not designed to be a scalable production operation. When the war began consuming its graduates at the rate of a Midway or a Guadalcanal, the Yokorin program did not have the institutional structure to replace them at speed, and the leadership of the Imperial Navy was, through the first years of the war, too committed to the proposition that its surviving veterans were sufficient to acknowledge fully how severe the deficit had become before it was too late to correct it. By June 1944, the pilots launching from Ozawa's carriers averaged significantly fewer than 300 flight hours. Some had less. The men opposing them over the Philippine Sea had been trained against captured zero performance data, had practiced against the exact maneuver profiles that Japanese pilots had relied on since the beginning of the war, and flew aircraft that would absorb damage that would have destroyed a zero and bring them home. This gap could not be closed by planning. It was the product of 3 years of attrition applied to a training system built for a different kind of war. Rear Admiral Agaki Matome, commanding the 1st Battleship Division and maintaining the diary that was published after the war under the title Fading Victory, was not present at the Philippine Sea engagement. His diary entries from this period, examined by historians including Gordon Prang and Donald Goldstein in their research on the Pacific War, reflect the assessment of a Japanese flag officer confronting the same arithmetic from a different vantage point. What Agaki recorded across this period was the observation of a professional who had watched a system fail at the institutional level and was trying, with the tools of his experience, to account for why the outcomes differed so completely from what doctrine had predicted. He did not find a satisfying answer because no satisfying answer existed. The doctrine had been built on conditions that no longer applied. In the months following the Philippine Sea catastrophe, combined fleet staff officers began planning the operations that would attempt to use what remained of Japanese naval strength in defense of the Philippine archipelago. The planning documents were designated the show operations. Shoichigo contemplated the commitment of the most powerful surface force Japan could still assemble, built around the battleships Yamato and Musashi, driving through the Philippine Straits to strike the American amphibious fleet at Leyte. Ozawa's carriers were in the plan. His remaining fleet and light carriers, along with 2 battleships that had been modified with flight decks but had no trained air groups to operate from them, were assigned a role that the planning documents described with the precise language of professional obligation and that the officers receiving those documents understood in plainer terms. His northern force would approach from the north and draw Halsey's Task Force 38 away from the landing beaches, creating the corridor through which Kurita's surface units would pass to attack the transports. Ozawa had approximately 100 aircraft distributed across his 4 remaining carriers. Task Force 38 had roughly 900. His force was to be a decoy. The planning documents acknowledged this implicitly. The USSBS interrogation of Ozawa, conducted after the surrender, asked him directly about his understanding of this role. He confirmed it without hesitation. He stated that he had understood when a northern force sortied for Leyte Gulf that his carriers were functioning as bait rather than as a combat arm, that their purpose was to draw the American fast carriers north rather than to achieve results through their own air power, and that this role was accepted because it was the only contribution his force could make to the operation's outcome. He said this without recorded bitterness or evasion. It was the professional assessment of an officer who had worked through the available options and concluded that none of them were adequate. Toyota activated Shoichigo on October 18, 1944, when American forces came ashore at Leyte. His signal to the fleet, recorded in American naval records in the translation, "Trusting in divine grace, the entire force will attack," went out knowing that the battle would consume a substantial portion of what remained of Japanese naval power. His testimony at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, delivered in the years that followed the war, addressed the strategic logic of the decision in terms that were among the most unsparing assessments any Japanese flag officer produced in the post-war period. He stated that by October 1944, the question was not whether to risk the fleet, but whether there was any purpose to preserving it. A fleet that could no longer fight was not a fleet. The show operation was an act of desperation that its planners understood was desperate. He said this, on the record, to a tribunal assembled to assess the conduct of Japan's war. The battle in the waters around Leyte Gulf ran for 4 days and has been measured by some accounts as the largest naval engagement in history by the number of vessels involved. Task Force 38 pursued Ozawa's northern force north exactly as the plan had required and destroyed it exactly as the plan had accepted. 4 of his carriers were sunk, among them the Zuikaku, the last surviving fleet carrier from the 6 that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack. Survivors of Zuikaku who had time to observe reported that her crew assembled on the flight deck as she went under and performed the formal ceremony of lowering the battle ensign before going over the side. Ozawa transferred his flag before she sank and continued to direct what remained of his force from a cruiser that survived the action. Kurita's center force, which was supposed to have driven through the corridor Ozawa's sacrifice created and struck the American landing ships at Leyte, turned back before reaching its target. The precise reasons for that decision have been contested by historians for decades and were contested by the Japanese officers involved from the moment the decision became known. What is not contested is the result. Ozawa's carriers were gone. The corridor through which Kurita was supposed to have driven was the only thing the Northern Force had been designed to produce. Kurita did not go through it. Ozawa received the news of Kurita's withdrawal the following day. He described his reaction in USSBS interrogation as one of profound professional frustration. The sacrifice had been accepted. The mission had been executed. The result had not been achieved. This is the documented record of what Japanese admirals said when American carriers crossed into their waters. Stripped of the public declarations and official communiques that surrounded those events and reduced to the after-action reports, the interrogation transcripts, the diary entries, and the tribunal testimony that constitutes the private accounting of the men who commanded the forces that were supposed to stop Task Force 58 and could not. What they said in those sources was not what the doctrine had promised. They said the plan had required conditions that were not present. They said their pilots were inadequate to the task assigned them. They said the radar-guided fighter direction of the American carriers had negated advantages they had built their tactical architecture on. They said the attrition of trained aircrew across 3 years of a war that consumed irreplaceable men faster than any training system could replace them had left a force that could commit to a decisive battle but could not win one. Ozawa said this directly to American officers on the record. Toyota said it at a tribunal. The diary of a Gaki recorded the progressive understanding of a flag officer watching the same conclusion arrive from a different angle. What they did not say in any of those sources was that the outcome had been a surprise to everyone who examined the actual numbers honestly. The numbers had been available. The trajectory had been legible. The institutional structure in which these officers operated made it difficult to state publicly what the numbers implied, and the war had no pause in which adjustments could be tested and implemented. The doctrine carried its momentum forward into conditions that had ceased to support it, and the men inside that doctrine were given the task of executing plans that required a force they no longer had. At 0810 on June 19th, 1944, a torpedo struck the Taiho at a range of 1,500 yards. The vapors reached ignition at 15:32. In the 7 hours and 22 minutes between those two events, Ozawa had launched 3 additional strike waves, committed more than 300 additional aircraft to attacks on an enemy force whose fighter direction was already preparing to intercept each wave before it arrived, and continued to execute a plan that the damage to his fuel system and the condition of the Marianas airfields had already made impossible. He had not known the plan was impossible. The information available to him had not told him. This is what the crossing of Japan's inviolable waters looked like from the Japanese side of the battle. The Pacific was not reclaimed by the decisive engagement the doctrine had specified, the final fleet action in chosen waters under favorable conditions with coordinated land and carrier air power. It was reclaimed by radar that saw incoming formations at 150 miles by Hellcats with enough fuel to hold their intercept altitude until the target arrived, by pilots who had been trained against the captured data of the aircraft they were shooting at, and by ships that could take damage and still operate. Against that system, the courage of the men who flew into it was real and documented and insufficient. The carriers burned and the aircraft did not return, and the doctrine that had promised a different result was filed in the after-action reports of the admirals who had believed it and could no longer. Thank you for watching. For more stories like this one, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.